Hey class, so we are just about halfway through the unit, and today we're going to be going over two objectives because they're so closely tied together, they're so closely related. So we're going to be talking about 5.6 and 5.7 today, which have to do with the economic and spatial organization of agriculture. So for College Board, this is what they've outlined for y'all to know. So both of these involve explaining how economic forces influence agricultural practices. And there's a lot of elements to this. So things like agricultural production regions are defined by the extent to which they reflect subsistence or commercial practices. So whether farmers are growing for themselves and their families, or whether they're doing more like mass large scale farming. Also, intensive and extensive farming practices have a lot to do with how much the land costs and how much transportation costs. So we're going to go through bid rent theory. Also, large-scale commercial agricultural operations are replacing small family farms. So we're seeing more and more businesses buy up smaller farms, smaller pieces of land, and then putting that together and having these huge commercial farms. Complex commodity chains link production and consumption of agricultural products. That's just talking about trade. We're going to hear a little bit more about that also in 5.9. And then finally, technology has increased economies of scale in the agricultural sector and carrying capacity of the land. So we're going to look at what that means for profits, and also how land is able to be more agriculturally productive. So, how do economic forces impact agriculture? So first we have subsistence agriculture. This is definitely a must know for you guys. You have to be able to think about, like, as soon as you hear subsistence, like, boom, you need to imagine like a family growing their own food. Okay, so these are crops and livestock that are grown to feed the farmer and the farmer's family, sometimes the surrounding community, but it's mostly for personal consumption. If there's any surplus, then maybe they'll trade with neighbors or sell at local markets. But this is very small scale farming. So this sometimes with the situation, markets are limited and farmers have less access to credit to pay for expensive farming improvements and labor. So the thing about farming, and the thing that I've come to appreciate about farmers, is that it is such an enormous upfront cost. So if farmers don't have access to credit, if they cannot take out loans in order to buy the equipment, in order to keep that land productive, if they don't have the ability to buy seeds are actually like super expensive. Then they are more limited as to like what they can grow. There's little income from farming, especially with this with subsistence farming. Manual and animal labor are used, as well as hand tools, as you can kind of see like pictured here, as opposed to like mechanized tools like machinery. And also there's a lack of infrastructure to facilitate global trade. So usually we see these people in more rural areas that aren't as connected, practicing subsistence farming, because they can't just easily load up their agricultural products and send them to different maybe ports, other trade routes. They're a little bit more outside of urban areas. We see this in periphery countries. So countries that are the producers of some of these, like, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but for periphery countries, think of countries that are still developing. So parts of rural Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Then we have commercial agriculture. So these are huge farms. They're meant for commercial purposes. So crops and livestock are grown to be sold on the global market. So these are meant for export. The whole point is making a profit. This has nothing to do with the farmer and his family, his or her family. They do this to make money, not to make food for themselves. Access to market and credit allow commercial farmers to purchase modern farm equipment, as pictured here. There's all kinds of really advanced technologies for farming now, and that just means that it's very expensive to initially purchase as well as to maintain. So taking out loans is kind of essential for these farmers. There's usually well-developed infrastructure in banking, transportation, and agricultural supply industries. So this is a whole very well-developed industry in terms of like being able to service farmers through loans, being able to service farmers through being able to transport their goods, and also being able to make and sell new technology. We usually see this in core and semi-periphery countries. So for core, think of highly developed countries, and for semi-periphery countries, countries that are kind of in the middle of developed and developing. So for economy of commercial agriculture, here we see monocropping, or the cultivation of one or maybe two crops, and those might have like seasonal rotations. But what this does is it allows for specialization and maximizes efficiency for higher yields. This is meant to be for profit. So we see this in plantations and like these huge corporate farms. Unfortunately, the downside to that has to do with the environment. It can really strip nutrients from the soil. It decreases biodiversity. And for small farmers that monocrop, they are more at risk of getting put out of business. Also, for supply and demand, if there's more supply than demand, if they have a lot of that product, then the price ends up going down. So sometimes for farmers, they're anticipating and hoping for a particular price point to sell these goods. Unfortunately, that can be unpredictable. And at the end of that harvest, they might have to sell it for a much lower cost than what they were expecting. So agribusiness, you absolutely have to know this term. So this is a large-scale system that includes the production, processing, and distribution, financial funding, and research of agricultural products and equipment. So just keep in mind, guys, like agriculture is such a huge business and there's so many different elements to it. I think that's part of the reason why I started to really enjoy this unit, is because you start to see, I guess, something you don't really think about, all the business that's behind our agriculture. So while a majority of farms worldwide are family owned, the rise of agribusiness has changed the nature of farming, replacing small family farms with giant agribusiness corporations. So now we're seeing less and less small farms. We're seeing less and less family-run farms, and instead we're seeing these like huge conglomerations of agribusinesses. So here are some examples. A lot of these will purchase farms from small businesses, from small farmers that are really struggling, and put them under their umbrella of farms. So with commercial agriculture, we have something called economies of scale. So essentially, with large-scale farming, it's a lot easier to be cost-effective. So those farmers have the ability to buy at bulk prices for different supplies or technologies. They use modern equipment. They use fertilizers and pesticides, which is like modern methods of farming, GMOs and hybrid seeds, also very modern. So all those kind of like came up during the Green Revolution. And all of that contributes to higher yields, which means more money, but it also means more initial purchase upfront. So bigger purchases due to bigger farms, hence cheaper prices. And when production increases, the costs of production decrease. So it is in their economic interest to grow as much as they can in terms of their agricultural products, because then overall they're spending less money. And because of that, there's a lot less family-owned farms. So for technological advances, we see, and I do encourage you guys to check out some of the Aspire to-dos, because they discuss this. They further increase the cost of operating farms, but also increases the efficiency of agriculture. So with these new technologies, to purchase them up front, it is very expensive, but ultimately it results in a more efficient system. It results in higher yields. It results in the ability to do more with less time. And ultimately, it increases the carrying capacity of that land. For commodity chains, again, like coming back to this idea of agribusiness, these commodity chains are a huge part of it. Transportation, processing, these different agricultural goods. There's a lot that goes into the products that we see on the shelves at the stores. It's a very complex network that connects places of production with distribution to consumers. So there's a lot of little steps that go from like growing from the ground to when we actually go to the store and purchase these things. Due to improvements in agricultural technology, agribusiness, and globalization, farmers tend to raise crops and animals far from their final markets, and consumers can purchase them at low prices. So having that transportation is really key. If they don't have reliable transportation and transportation that can be affordable, then they would have to be closer to city centers where these products would be sold. And that comes into the bid rent theory. This is really important for y'all to understand. And this is just that relationship for the value of the land or the cost of the land and its relationship or distance to the market. Think of market as like cities, city centers where people buy these things. So the most desirable and accessible land is near the market and costs the most money. So just as we've talked about in other chapters, like when you have a high concentration of people in an area, the real estate is going to be more expensive because then it's less available. So the further away, the more affordable it is. Farmers are able to purchase less land, so farming is typically intensive in order to earn a profit. The least desirable and accessible land is located the furthest from the market and costs the least money. So farmers are able to purchase more land, and farming is typically extensive and can earn a profit. So if we think about in terms of that distance from the market, things like, let's say, ranching, that's going to be much further away. The more land is needed, and if it's cheaper, the further away for that type of agriculture, then that's where you're going to see that. Whereas, let's say, smaller farms with intensive type of products, that's going to be closer to city centers. So that covers both 5.6 and 7. I will see you guys in the next objective.